A teacher believed her cruelty was a secret, a necessary tool to manage a difficult child in a world that wouldn't listen to his silent screams. She was a pillar of the community, an award-winning educator whose word was bond. The boy was a whisper, a ghost in his own life, a child whose truth was trapped behind a wall of silence. She never imagined that the one person who would finally hear him wouldn't be a principal or a social worker, but a monster of a man covered in ink and leather, sitting on the other side of a chain-link fence. What happened next wasn't just a confrontation. It was a reckoning, delivered by 200 angels who rode machines of steel and thunder, proving that the most powerful force on earth is a promise made to a child who has lost all hope. The fluorescent lights of the Greasy Spoon Diner hummed a tired, buzzing song. They cast a jaundiced glow on the cracked red vinyl of the booths, and the rivers of old sugar stuck to the sides of the dispensers. For 8-year-old Leo, the diner was a symphony of chaos. The clang of plates from the kitchen was like a hammer blow. The low murmur of conversations from other booths was a tangled mess of sound that his mind couldn't sort. The sharp, greasy smell of frying bacon warred with the cloying sweetness of spilled syrup. It was all too much. He sat hunched over the table, his small shoulders drawn up to his ears as if to physically block out the noise. His worn blue hoodie, a size too big, swallowed his frail frame. Faded jeans, patched at the knee, were frayed at the ankles, revealing mismatched socks. In his hands, he clutched a small spiral-bound notepad and a stub of a pencil, his knuckles white. His world had shrunk to this small square of paper. Here, he had control. Here, there was no noise. Across from him, his grandmother, Eleanor, watched him with eyes that held a universe of worry. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, trembled slightly as she wrapped them around a lukewarm mug of coffee. Her face was a roadmap of a long, hard life, but the deepest lines were etched around her eyes, carved there by a constant, gnawing anxiety for the small boy in front of her. She saw the way he flinched when the waitress dropped a fork. She saw the dark smudges under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. She saw the faint, yellowish bruise on his forearm, peeking from the edge of his sleeve, a bruise he instinctively tried to hide whenever she looked too closely. "Leo, honey, you should eat something," she whispered, her voice as fragile as a dry leaf. She pushed a plate with a half-eaten pancake toward him. He didn't look up. His pencil just kept moving, scratching across the paper with a frantic energy. He was drawing the same thing he always drew now, a box. Inside the box, a small stick figure, and outside the box, a large, jagged shape that looked like a screaming mouth. Eleanor's heart clenched. It started a few months ago. Her bright, curious Leo, who loved to line up his dinosaur toys and tell her their long, complicated names, began to retreat. He stopped talking about the Triceratops and the Velociraptor. He stopped meeting her eyes. Then, he stopped talking altogether, except for a few whispered words when the terror of a nightmare woke him in the middle of the night. The silence had started right after he was placed in Mrs. Albright's classroom. She had tried. Oh, how she had tried. She had gone to the school, her heart pounding in her chest. She had sat in the small, uncomfortable chair opposite Principal Davison's large, imposing desk. He had listened with a patient, condescending smile as she explained her worries. He had folded his hands and told her that Mrs. Albright was their Teacher of the Year. He said she had a special gift for challenging students. He used phrases like adjustment period and behavioral issues. He suggested that perhaps Leo was the problem, that his autism made him prone to fantasy and exaggeration. He had made her feel small, old, and foolish. The waitress, a young woman named Brenda with a pencil tucked behind her ear and a permanent look of exhaustion, came by to refill Eleanor's coffee. Eleanor cleared her throat, gathering a shred of courage. "Excuse me," she began, her voice barely audible over the diner's din. "My grandson, he's having such a hard time at school. His teacher—" Brenda just sighed, sloshing coffee into the mug. "Honey, everyone's kid is having a hard time. It's a tough world. You want the check?" She didn't wait for an answer, just slapped the small slip of paper on the table and moved on. The dismissal was a physical blow. Another door shut. Another person who wouldn't listen. Eleanor shrank back into the booth, the fight draining out of her. She was just an old woman. Mrs. Albright was an institution, Who would ever believe her? The noise in the diner seemed to crescendo. A baby started crying in the next booth. The cook shouted an order. The front door opened with a jingle, letting in a blast of cold air and street noise. It was too much for Leo. The pencil snapped in his small hand. A tiny, choked sound escaped his lips. His whole body went rigid. Before Eleanor could react, he slid out of the booth and was gone, a small, desperate shadow darting for the exit. "Leo!" Eleanor cried, fumbling for her purse, her old bones protesting as she tried to stand. Outside, the air was cold and gray. Leo stood on the cracked pavement, his chest heaving. The world was still loud, but it was a different kind of loud. The roar of traffic was a steady rhythm, not the sharp, unpredictable chaos of the diner. He wrapped his arms around himself, seeking a comfort he couldn't find. And then he saw him. Sitting on a low brick wall bordering the diner's parking lot was a man who looked like he was carved from stone and shadow. He was immense, with shoulders as wide as a doorway. A thick, graying beard covered the lower half of his face, and his long hair was tied back in a simple leather cord. He wore a black leather vest, worn and cracked with age, covered in patches that Leo couldn't read. His arms were a tapestry of faded tattoos, snakes and skulls and flames that coiled over mountains of muscle. A long, silvery scar cut a path from his left temple down to a jaw that looked like it could chew through steel. He was the most intimidating person Leo had ever seen, but he was still. In the middle of the world's noise, he was an island of perfect, unmoving quiet. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just nursing a cup of coffee held in hands that could have crushed it without a thought. He didn't seem angry or mean. He just seemed there, like a mountain, like a wall that doesn't move. Leo's fear, the panic that had driven him from the diner, began to recede, replaced by a strange, inexplicable curiosity. He had been taught to fear strangers, especially men who looked like this. But his instincts, the deep, primal senses that guided him through a world he didn't understand, told him something different. This man was not a source of chaos. He was the opposite of it. Slowly, hesitantly, Leo took a step forward, then another. He clutched his notepad, the broken pencil still held tight in his fist. He walked right up to the giant, stopping a few feet away, and just stood there, watching him. The man's eyes moved, slowly, until they rested on Leo. They weren't cold or cruel. They were a deep, dark brown, and they were tired, but they were also incredibly observant. They saw the oversized hoodie, the fear in the boy's posture, the notepad held like a shield. The man didn't speak. He just watched Leo, giving him the space to make the next move. Leo took a deep breath. He held up his notepad. He turned it so the man could see the drawing, the box, the tiny figure trapped inside, the jagged, screaming mouth looming over it. He held it there, his small arm trembling with the effort, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was it. This was his voice. The man known as Bear looked at the drawing. He didn't just glance at it, he studied it. His gaze was intense, analytical. He saw the frantic, desperate lines. He saw the way the figure inside the box was curled into a ball. He saw the raw terror captured in the simple, childish sketch. He had seen drawings like this before, in another life, a life before the leather and the road, a life where he had worn a badge instead of patches. He recognized the language of fear. He slowly lowered his coffee cup, placing it carefully on the brick wall beside him. He reached into the pocket of his jeans, his large hand moving with a surprising gentleness. He pulled out a small, smooth gray stone, worn by the current of some long-forgotten river. It was his worry stone, a piece of the earth he carried to keep his own demons at bay. He held it out on his open palm, an offering. "For you," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like gravel shifting deep underground. It wasn't loud or demanding. It was a statement, a gift. Leo stared at the stone. It was perfect, smooth and solid and real. He hesitantly reached out his small, trembling hand and took it. The stone was cool against his skin. He closed his fingers around it, a small, solid piece of quiet in a world of noise. He looked up at the giant, his eyes wide. Just then, Eleanor burst out of the diner, her face pale with panic. "Leo, oh thank God." She rushed forward, ready to scold him, ready to pull him away from the terrifying man. But she stopped short when she saw them. She saw her grandson, who flinched from almost every human touch, standing perfectly still, less than a foot from this behemoth. She saw the look on Leo's face, not fear, but a profound, startling calm. And she saw the way the big man was looking at her grandson, with an expression of such focused, gentle intensity that it took her breath away. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her hand fluttering to her chest. "He just ran out. He gets overwhelmed. I'm so sorry to have bothered you." Bear's eyes shifted from Leo to Eleanor. He saw the same fear there, the same exhaustion, the same deep, bone-weary sadness. He saw the way she looked at Leo, a fierce, protective love struggling against a tide of helplessness. He gave a slow, deliberate nod toward the notepad still clutched in Leo's other hand. "He was showing me his drawing," Bear said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the air feel heavy. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "He draws it all the time. He won't talk anymore." The words came out in a broken whisper, the dam of her composure finally cracking. The sight of this stranger's quiet attention was the one act of kindness she hadn't been prepared for. It undid her. "Tell me," Bear said. It wasn't a question. It was a calm, simple command, an invitation into a safe space. And so, standing in the cold, gray parking lot of a cheap diner, with the smell of grease in the air and the roar of traffic in the distance, Eleanor told him everything. She told him about the wonderful boy Leo had been, full of facts about dinosaurs and stars. She told him about the new teacher, Mrs. Albright, and how the light had gone out of Leo's eyes. She told him about the bruises she couldn't explain, the nightmares that left Leo's sheets soaked with sweat, the way he had started to shrink, to disappear into himself. She told him about Principal Davison and his condescending smiles, his polished excuses, his casual dismissal of her fears. She told him about being alone, about having no one to turn to, no one who would believe the word of a frightened old woman and a silent little boy against that of a teacher of the year. As she spoke, Bear listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes. He just listened, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He absorbed every word, every tremor in her voice, every flicker of pain in her expression. He felt a familiar, cold rage beginning to build in his chest, an old ghost he had tried to bury long ago. He thought of his own daughter, taken from him by a sickness years ago, and the fierce, useless promise he had made to her to always keep her safe. He had failed then. He would not fail now. When Eleanor finished, she was weeping silently, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Leo stood beside Bear, clutching the smooth gray stone, his anchor in the storm. Bear looked down at the boy. He saw the resilience there, the small flicker of courage it had taken to approach a stranger, to show him the truth in a drawing. He then looked back at the grandmother, a woman who had fought until she had nothing left. He reached into his vest and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He took out a small blank card and a pen. He wrote down a name, just Bear, and a phone number. He handed it to Eleanor. "He won't be going back there alone," Bear said, his voice a low, steady vow. "I promise you, we're going to listen." The words were simple, but they were forged in something ancient and unbreakable. They were the promise of a protector. "You're not alone anymore." Eleanor took the card, her trembling fingers brushing against his tattooed ones. For the first time in months, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. She looked at the giant of a man, at her quiet grandson standing beside him, and she believed him. That night, the old rotary phone in Bear's small, sparse apartment rang only once. He answered it before the second ring could start. The apartment was clean, almost military in its orderliness. There were no decorations, save for a single, small, framed photo on his nightstand of a little girl with a bright, gap-toothed smile. It faced away from the bed. He sat on the edge of his mattress, the phone pressed to his ear. On the other end, Eleanor's voice was thin, choked with a fresh wave of fear. "He had another nightmare," she whispered. "A bad one. He was screaming a name. The quiet room. He kept screaming about a quiet room." Bear's jaw tightened. The cold rage inside him solidified into ice. a quiet room, a place of isolation, a place of punishment, a cage. The drawing on the notepad flashed in his mind. The box. "I'm handling it," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock for her to cling to. "Get some rest, both of you. I'll call you in the morning with a plan. Just keep him home from school tomorrow. Tell them he's sick." "Okay," she whispered, the single word filled with a desperate, trusting faith. After he hung up, Bear sat in the darkness for a long time. He thought about systems. He thought about badges and procedures and reports filed in triplicate. He thought about all the rules that were supposed to protect children like Leo, rules that were so easily bent and broken by people with respectable smiles and hidden cruelties. He had once believed in those rules. He had lost his faith the day he had to fill out a report on his own daughter's passing, reducing his entire world to a set of cold, bureaucratic boxes to be checked. The system had failed Leo. It was time for a different system. He picked up his cell phone, a cheap, durable flip phone, and dialed a number he knew by heart. It was answered on the first ring. "Preacher?" Bear said, his voice low. "Bear, it's late." "Trouble?" The voice on the other end was calm, deep, and carried an easy authority. "I've got a code 9, Bear said. There was no hesitation, no questions. The trust between them was absolute, forged over decades of shared miles and shared battles. A code 9 was the club's most sacred call to arms. It meant a child was in danger. It was the one call that superseded everything else. "Where and when?" Preacher asked, his voice already shifting, the calm authority sharpening to a razor's edge. "Sunrise, the old quarry off Route 7, Bear replied. "It's a teacher, a school." "We'll be there," Preacher said. "All of us." The line went dead. The call went out like a ripple in a dark pond. From Preacher to his sergeant-at-arms, and from there, down the phone tree. In garages and workshops, in quiet suburban homes and lonely apartments all across the state, phones buzzed and rang. A mechanic named Crusher, his hands permanently stained with grease, wiped his palms on a rag and nodded, his work on a vintage engine forgotten. A man named Silas, a corporate lawyer who spent his days in $1,000 suits, sat in his leather office chair, looked at the city lights below, and sent a single text: "I'm in." A former police detective named Hawk, who now ran a private security firm, closed his laptop on a cheating spouse case and started cleaning the lenses on a long-range camera. A young tech wizard called Glitch, surrounded by a nest of monitors and cables in his mother's basement, pushed his glasses up his nose and started typing furiously, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he began to dig into the school district's public records. They came from all walks of life. They were fathers and grandfathers, mechanics and lawyers, veterans and construction workers. On the outside, they were disparate, unconnected men, but they were all bound by one thing: the patch on their back. The patch of the Iron Sentinels. And the Sentinels had one unbreakable rule: you don't let a child suffer. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray, a low rumble began to build on the horizon. It started as a distant hum, then grew into a deep, guttural growl. It was the sound of thunder, but there were no clouds in the sky. It was the sound of an army waking up. From highways and back roads, they converged on the abandoned quarry. A river of single headlights cut through the morning mist. They rolled in not as a chaotic mob, but with a quiet, disciplined precision that spoke of years of riding together. They parked their bikes in neat, orderly rows, the chrome glinting in the growing light. 200 men, 200 steel horses, an ocean of leather and denim and quiet, grim resolve. They gathered around Bear and Preacher, forming a silent circle. Preacher, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard and the calm, steady eyes of a born leader, stood beside Bear. Bear told them everything. He told them about Leo, about his silence, his drawings, his fear. He told them about Eleanor, her helplessness, her desperation. He told them about Mrs. Albright, the teacher of the year, and Principal Davison, the guardian of her reputation. He held up Leo's notepad, showing them the drawing of the box and the screaming mouth. A low growl rippled through the crowd. These were hard men, men who had seen the worst of the world. But the sight of that simple, terrified drawing struck a chord deep inside each of them. It was a declaration of war. "Violence is not the answer," Preacher said, his voice cutting through the rising anger. "Not yet. This woman, this teacher, she's hidden behind her reputation. The principal is her shield. We can't just go in there like a wrecking ball. We go in like surgeons. We need to cut the cancer out, but we need to do it clean, so it can't ever grow back." He looked to the assembled men, his gaze sweeping over them. "We are not criminals. We are not vigilantes. We are fathers. We are grandfathers. We are sentinels. And our purpose is to stand guard. Today, we stand guard for a boy named Leo." He turned to his specialists. "Hawk," he said. Hawk stepped forward. He was a lean, wiry man in his 50s, with eyes that missed nothing. "I'll need a position with a clear view of the playground and the school exits. A van across the street should do. I'll get video, high definition. We need to see her face. We need to see the boy's reaction. We need evidence that a court can't dismiss." "Glitch," Preacher said. The young man, barely out of his 20s, adjusted his glasses. "I'm already in their system. School board meeting is Tuesday night. Public record. I'm digging into Albright's history. Any complaints, any transfers. They bury that stuff, but they don't ever really delete it. I'll find it. I'll also set up a remote audio feed for Hawk, just in case we can snag something from a parabolic mic." Silas, the lawyer, now dressed in worn jeans and a leather jacket, stepped forward. He looked out of place, yet perfectly at home. "I'll draft a formal request for Eleanor to speak at the board meeting. We'll file it this morning. They'll try to table it, but they have to accept it. It's public forum. Once she's on the agenda, they can't ignore her, not with us in the room." Preacher nodded, his expression grim. "The rest of us, we form a perimeter, a quiet one. 2 bikes at the end of Leo's street in the morning, 2 more along the route to the school. Not close enough to spook them, but close enough to be there if something happens. We're ghosts, we're shadows, until it's time not to be." He looked at Bear. "You're with the family, you're their rock. Keep them safe, keep them calm. Let them know the cavalry has arrived." Bear just nodded. The plan was set. The pieces were in motion. The Iron Sentinels were going to war, not with fists and chains, but with cameras, computers, and the unyielding pressure of 200 righteous men. The next 2 days were a blur of tense, quiet activity. Hawk found the perfect spot, a plumber's van he'd borrowed and parked across from Northwood Elementary. He sat in the back, surrounded by monitors, his long-range lens focused on the playground gate. He was a patient predator, waiting. Glitch worked his magic, his fingers a blur on his keyboard. He found it buried deep in the district's archives. 2 other complaints against Mrs. Albright from years past, from 2 different schools. Both had been dismissed after the families had suddenly and mysteriously moved out of the district. He found financial records, too. Mrs. Albright had a significant gambling debt. It wasn't a motive for abuse, not directly, but it spoke to a life of hidden desperation, of a person living a lie. Silas filed the paperwork. As predicted, the principal's office tried to push back, claiming the agenda was full. Silas calmly cited 3 different sections of the state's education code until they relented. Eleanor was on the docket. Tuesday, 7 p.m. Bear stayed with Leo and Eleanor. He didn't hover. He just existed in their space, a mountain of quiet strength. He sat at their small kitchen table, drinking coffee, while Leo drew at the other end. The boy's drawings started to change. He still drew the box, but now, outside the box, he began to draw a large, powerful figure, a bear. On Tuesday, the air was thick with a nervous energy. Hawk had been watching the playground for 2 days, and what he saw was chilling. Mrs. Albright was a master of her craft. In the open, with other teachers and aides present, she was the picture of doting professionalism, always ready with a kind word or a gentle hand on a student's shoulder. But her eyes were always on Leo. She isolated him, subtly at first, guiding him to the far corners of the yard, away from prying eyes. It happened on Tuesday afternoon, just hours before the board meeting. Most of the children were gathered around a kickball game. Mrs. Albright led Leo toward a secluded area behind the gymnasium, ostensibly to practice with a set of alphabet blocks. Her back was to the school, but her face was in perfect view of Hawk's camera. Hawk leaned forward, his finger hitting the record button. He zoomed in. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The teacher's warm, smiling mask dissolved. Her face twisted into a snarl of pure, undiluted rage. Her smile became a tight, bloodless line. She grabbed Leo's arm, her fingers digging into his bicep. Hawk could see the boy's small body go rigid with terror. Mrs. Albright leaned down, her face inches from his. The video had no sound, but Hawk could read her lips. The words were poison. Useless. Stupid. Why can't you just be normal? She shook him, a quick, violent jerk. Leo stumbled, his eyes wide with a silent, pleading panic. She then dragged him toward a small, windowless shed at the back of the gym, the place where they stored old sporting equipment, the quiet room. Hawk's blood ran cold. He kept recording, capturing every second of the raw, unfiltered cruelty. He saw her shove Leo inside and slam the door, her face a mask of smug satisfaction as she turned and walked away, smoothing her hair, the persona of the caring teacher snapping back into place as if it had never left. "Got you," Hawk whispered into his microphone, his voice tight. "Glitch, I'm sending the file. Clean it up. We're going live tonight." The school board meeting was held in the high school auditorium. The room was half full, with the usual attendees. A few concerned parents, some bored-looking teachers, and a local newspaper reporter. On the stage, the 5 members of the school board sat behind a long table, looking self-important. Principal Davison sat in the front row, next to a smiling, confident Mrs. Albright. They were there to receive a commendation for the school's recent test scores. Eleanor sat near the back, Bear on one side of her, Preacher on the other. She was twisting a handkerchief in her hands, her heart pounding. "You can do this," Bear rumbled softly. "Just tell the truth. We'll handle the rest." Her name was called. She walked to the podium on trembling legs. She adjusted the microphone and began to speak, her voice barely a whisper at first, but growing stronger as she went on. She told them about her Leo, about the boy he was and the silent, frightened child he had become. She spoke of the bruises, the nightmares, the drawing of the cage. She looked directly at Principal Davison. "I came to you," she said, her voice shaking with a quiet, righteous anger. "I begged you to listen, and you told me I was a foolish old woman. You told me my grandson was the problem." Davison stood up, his face a mask of practiced concern. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we have investigated your claims. Mrs. Albright is a consummate professional. There is no evidence to support these fantasies." He gestured to Mrs. Albright, who gave the board a sad, sympathetic smile. "She has done wonders with a very challenging child." The board members nodded, their minds already made up. It was the word of a respected principal against a frail, emotional grandmother. The case was closed. And then it happened. The large double doors at the back of the auditorium creaked open. Every head turned. 200 men filed in. They moved in absolute silence. There was no noise, no chatter, just the soft, rhythmic scuff of 200 pairs of boots on the polished floor. They were an ocean of black leather and faded denim. They filled every empty seat. They lined the back wall, standing shoulder to shoulder, their arms crossed. They filled the side aisles. The air in the room changed. The temperature seemed to drop. The bored expressions on the faces of the board members evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief and a dawning sense of fear. Principal Davison faltered, his words dying in his throat. Mrs. Albright's sad smile froze on her face, cracking like cheap porcelain. Preacher detached himself from the silent army and walked slowly, deliberately, down the center aisle. He didn't swagger, he didn't threaten. He moved with the undeniable gravity of a man who held all the power in the room. He walked past Eleanor, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze, and stopped at the podium next to her. He didn't address the board, he addressed the room. "My name is Preacher," he said, his voice calm and clear, needing no microphone. "We are the Iron Sentinels, and we are here tonight because we believe in listening to children, especially the ones who can't speak for themselves." He looked at the board president. "We have something we'd like to add to the public record." He nodded toward the back of the room. Glitch, sitting at the audio-visual controls, hit a key on his laptop. The large projector screen behind the school board, which had been displaying the district's logo, flickered to life. It was Hawk's video. The auditorium was silent, save for the hum of the projector. The footage played, stark and undeniable. They saw Mrs. Albright's face twist from a smile into a mask of rage. They saw her grab Leo's arm. They saw her spit the silent, venomous words. They saw the terror on the little boy's face. They saw her shove him into the dark shed and walk away, a portrait of casual cruelty. A collective gasp swept through the room. The local reporter was scribbling furiously. Parents in the audience were looking at each other in horror, reevaluating every interaction their own children had ever had with this woman. Mrs. Albright leaped to her feet, her face white with panic and rage. Her carefully constructed world was shattering in front of her eyes. "This is a lie," she shrieked, her voice high and shrill. "That video is edited. It's fake. I would never. He is a disturbed child. He's a liar. He provokes it. He belongs in a special facility, not in my classroom." The word hung in the air, heavy and damning. Belongs. A word of ownership. A word of dehumanization. It was the final fatal crack in her mask. In that moment, everyone in the room saw her for what she was, not a teacher, but a monster. Principal Davison was trying to speak, to do damage control, but no one was listening. The board members were staring, aghast, at the screen, then at the furious woman, then at the silent army of bikers who stood like stone statues, their eyes fixed on her. The auditorium doors opened again. This time, it was 2 uniformed police officers. Hawk had made the call the moment Mrs. Albright had confessed with her own hateful words. He had sent the video file to his old partner at the precinct, along with the address of the school board meeting. He had told them to be ready. The officers walked calmly down the aisle, their expressions grim. They walked right up to Mrs. Albright. "Ma'am," the senior officer said, his voice devoid of emotion, "you need to come with us." Her face crumpled. The fight went out of her. She was just a cornered, pathetic bully. They cuffed her hands behind her back and led her away, her shrieking protests echoing in the stunned silence of the room. The arrest was the dam breaking. The aftermath was a flood. The local news story went viral, a tale of a beloved teacher unmasked by a motorcycle club. The video was played on every news channel. The story of the Leo Law was born. Emboldened by the Iron Sentinel's stand, other parents came forward. A mother whose child had been in Albright's class 2 years prior tearfully admitted that her son had come home with unexplained scratches and a sudden crippling fear of closets. A father from another district recognized Albright from a school his daughter had attended 5 years ago, a daughter who had to undergo therapy for severe anxiety that began in the 3rd grade. A pattern of abuse, long hidden and dismissed, was finally brought into the light. The legal proceedings were swift and decisive. Mrs. Albright, faced with overwhelming video evidence and a mountain of corroborating testimony, was convicted on multiple counts of child abuse and unlawful imprisonment. Principal Davison was fired for gross negligence. His career in education finished. The school board issued a public apology and, under immense pressure, instituted a sweeping new set of policies for protecting vulnerable students, including mandatory body cameras for special education teachers during one-on-one sessions, a policy that became known as Leo's Law. The judge, a stern woman with no tolerance for predators who hid behind a professional title, delivered her sentencing with cold fury. "You were entrusted with the care of our most vulnerable children," she said, her voice ringing through the packed courtroom. "You were given their trust and their parents' trust, and you twisted that sacred duty into a weapon of terror. You preyed on a child who could not speak out against you. You built your reputation on the silent suffering of those you were sworn to protect. This court will not tolerate it." The sentence was the maximum allowed by law. But for the Iron Sentinels, justice wasn't just about a verdict. It was about healing the wounds. The day after the arrest, a convoy of pickup trucks and motorcycles pulled up in front of Eleanor's small, weathered house. The roof was leaking, the paint was peeling, and the front steps were sagging. For 2 days, the bikers worked. They weren't a loud, rowdy crew. They were a quiet, efficient team. Crusher, the mechanic, led a team that patched and reshingled the entire roof. Hawk, the security expert, installed a new set of locks and a simple, effective security system. Others painted the house a cheerful, sunny yellow. They fixed the broken fence, planted a small garden full of bright flowers, and rebuilt the front steps, making them solid and safe. Inside, they stocked the pantry and the refrigerator until they were overflowing. Silas, the lawyer, had discovered that Eleanor was struggling under a mountain of medical bills and credit card debt. He had worked with Preacher to set up an anonymous trust, funded by the club's emergency benevolent fund and private donations from every single member. The trust paid off all her debts and established a separate account for Leo's future education and therapy. Leo watched it all from the living room window, the smooth gray stone from Bear held tightly in his hand. He saw these large, loud, scary-looking men performing small acts of incredible kindness. He saw them working, sweating, even laughing quietly amongst themselves. They weren't monsters, they were builders, they were healers. Bear spent most of his time inside, sitting at the kitchen table, just being there. He showed Leo how to polish a piece of chrome from his bike until it shone like a mirror. He didn't push him to talk. He just shared the silence with him. On the second day, as the work was finishing up, Leo picked up his notepad. He drew a picture of his house, now bright and strong. He drew the flowers in the garden, and all around the house, he drew dozens of motorcycles standing guard. Then he looked at Bear, and for the first time in months, he spoke. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rusty from disuse. Bear's heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone long ago, felt a warmth spread through it. He just nodded, placing a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "You're welcome, kid. We're family now." 1 year later, the sun shone brightly on the grounds of the Oak Creek Academy, a special school that celebrated neurodiversity. It was Family Fun Day, and the lawn was filled with children laughing, parents chatting, and the smell of hot dogs on the grill. Leo was no longer a silent ghost. He was a vibrant, happy 9-year-old. He ran across the grass, chasing a soccer ball with a new friend, his laughter clear and bright. He still had his quiet moments, still preferred order and routine, but the fear was gone. The cage was broken. Sitting at a picnic table, watching him, was a large contingent of the Iron Sentinels. They had become a permanent fixture in Leo and Eleanor's lives. They were uncles, grandfathers, and protectors. They showed up for birthdays, helped with homework, and took Leo for his first, very slow, ride on a motorcycle around a deserted parking lot. Bear sat at the head of the table, a gentle smile on his face. He watched Leo stumble, get back up, and kick the ball into the goal. He saw the pure, unadulterated joy on the boy's face, and he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. The ghost of his own loss still lingered, but it no longer haunted him. It reminded him of his purpose. Leo saw him watching. He abandoned the game and ran full tilt toward the picnic table. He didn't slow down. He launched himself at Bear, wrapping his small arms around the biker's thick neck in a fierce, clumsy hug. Bear was so startled he almost fell backward. He froze for a second. Then his own massive arms came up and enveloped the boy, holding him tight. It was the first unsolicited hug Leo had given anyone since before the silence had started. It was a hug of trust, of safety, of love. Preacher watched them, a knowing look in his eyes. He leaned over to Silas. "That," he said quietly, "is why we ride." Heroes don't always wear shining armor or capes that flutter in the wind. Sometimes they wear leather that smells of road dust and engine oil. Sometimes their halos are the glint of sun on chrome, and their chariots are built of steel and thunder. But their true strength, their real power, isn't in their intimidating presence or the roar of their engines. It's in their profound, unwavering willingness to listen. It's in their ability to hear the silent scream of a single, forgotten child, and to answer that call with the full, righteous fury of their collective heart. They are the ones who show up when the rest of the world has turned away, becoming a wall that will not move, a promise that will not break, and a family for those who have lost their own. They are the Sentinels, and they are always on guard.